On a September morning in 1408, two figures stood before an altar of stone inside the church at Halsey, in the far southwestern reaches of Greenland. Thorstein Olafsson, a ship's captain from Iceland, took the hand of Sigrid Björnsdottir as priests read the banns and witnesses gathered in the cool Nordic light. The walls of the church rose nearly 6 meters high, their whitewashed stones visible for miles across the fjord waters. Nothing about this ceremony suggested catastrophe. The proper rituals were observed, the formalities honored. The couple would later sail for Iceland, where records of their lives continued in ink and parchment. But they left behind something far more haunting than a marriage certificate. They left behind the last written words from a civilization that was about to vanish from the earth. Within decades of that wedding, every Norse man, woman, and child in Greenland would disappear. Not in some dramatic final battle, not in any event that anyone bothered to record. They simply ceased to exist, leaving behind ruined farmsteads, empty churches, and one of history's most confounding mysteries. For nearly 500 years, European Christians had survived at the edge of the habitable world, building cathedrals, raising cattle, trading ivory across thousands of miles of treacherous ocean. Then they were gone, as if swallowed by the ice itself. What pressure could break a people who had already conquered the impossible? What forces gathered against these settlers in the final century of their existence? And what decisions, made under conditions of desperate uncertainty, sealed their fate? To understand the ending, we must return to the beginning, not to the crisis, but to the dream. In the summer of 985, a fleet of 25 ships departed the coast of Iceland, their square sails catching the North Atlantic wind. At the head of this convoy stood Erik Thorvaldsson, a man whose red beard had earned him a name that would echo through centuries. Erik the Red had been exiled twice for killing men in disputes, driven from Norway and then from Iceland by blood feuds and the judgment of courts. But exile, for Erik, became opportunity. 3 years earlier, while serving his banishment, he had explored the western lands that Icelandic sailors whispered about. He found a coastline of dramatic fjords, cutting deep into the land, protected valleys where grass grew thick in summer, waters teeming with seals and fish. Most importantly, he found a place beyond the reach of those who wanted him dead. Now he returned with followers. Of the 25 ships that departed Iceland, only 14 reached their destination safely. Storms scattered the fleet, ships sank, families drowned in the cold Atlantic waters. Yet those who survived found precisely what Erik had promised: sheltered fjords, meadows green with summer growth, and land unclaimed by any European power. Erik named this place Greenland, a name that later generations would mock as deceptive advertising. But in those first years, the name held truth. The medieval climate was warmer than today. Grass grew tall enough to sustain cattle. The sheltered heads of the fjords offered temperatures mild enough for farming. For settlers fleeing overcrowded Iceland, this was genuine opportunity. Within a generation, the Norse Greenlanders had established 2 major settlement areas along the southwestern coast. The eastern settlement, despite its name located in the south near modern Qeqertak, grew to contain roughly 4,000 inhabitants spread across 500 farms. The smaller western settlement, some 300 kilometers to the north near present-day Nuuk, housed perhaps another 1,000 souls. Between them, smaller clusters of farms dotted the coastline wherever conditions permitted. Daily life in these settlements followed patterns familiar to any medieval Scandinavian farmer. Cattle grazed in summer pastures, their milk transformed into butter and cheese that would sustain families through the long winter darkness. Sheep provided wool for the clothing that meant survival in this climate. Goats browsed on vegetation too rough for other animals. The rhythms of the agricultural year dominated existence. The desperate race to harvest hay before autumn frost. The careful rationing of fodder through months when darkness lasted 20 hours each day. The anxious counting of surviving livestock when spring finally returned. The farmsteads themselves reflected both practical necessity and surprising ambition. Thick walls of stone and turf provided insulation against cold that could kill the unprepared. Byres connected directly to living quarters, allowing families to tend their animals without venturing into blizzards. Yet these were not merely survival shelters. Excavations have revealed crafted household goods, imported luxuries, signs of social stratification and aspiration. Some farms grew quite wealthy, their stables capable of housing 100 cattle, their halls suitable for hosting feasts that reinforced the social bonds holding this isolated community together. And at the center of it all stood the church. Christianity reached Greenland around the year 1000, brought by Erik's own son Leif, who would later earn fame as the first European to set foot on North American shores. Erik himself reportedly resisted the new faith, clinging to the old Norse gods. But his wife Jodhild embraced Christianity with such fervor that she commissioned Greenland's first church, a small structure whose foundations archaeologists would excavate 1,000 years later. By 1124, Greenland had achieved something remarkable for a colony so isolated: its own bishop. The Norwegian king approved the establishment of a diocese at Gardar, where a cathedral dedicated to St. Nicholas eventually rose in cruciform splendor. Built from red sandstone quarried from nearby hills, featuring imported glass windows and bronze bells, the cathedral measured 27 meters in length. The bishop's farm could shelter 100 cattle. Stained glass filtered light into a space designed to all worshippers who lived most of their lives in turf and stone farmhouses. For roughly 2 centuries, this system functioned. Not without hardship, certainly. Child mortality ran devastatingly high. Archaeological evidence from the cemetery at Brattahlid, Erik the Red's own estate, reveals that of 24 children buried there, 15 were infants. Life remained precarious. But the settlements grew. Churches multiplied. Trade ships arrived from Norway and Iceland, bringing iron, timber, grain, and news from the wider world. The Greenlanders, in turn, had something Europe desperately wanted. The economic engine that made this remote colony viable traveled on flippers and had tusks.
Walrus ivory had been prized in medieval Europe since the Viking Age, before elephant ivory flooded the market in later centuries. Walrus tusks provided material for the exquisite carved objects that decorated churches, adorned nobles, and demonstrated wealth and piety. The famous Lewis chessmen, those hauntingly expressive game pieces now divided between museums in Edinburgh and London, were carved from walrus ivory. Church officials used walrus ivory for croziers, reliquaries, crucifixes. The material commanded premium prices throughout the Romanesque period of European art, and Greenland had walruses in abundance. Every summer, hunting parties departed the settlements for the waters around Disko Bay, some 500 kilometers to the north. There, where the cold Greenland current kept waters productive, walrus colonies hauled out on rocky beaches in numbers sufficient to supply the medieval luxury trade. The hunters traveled in open boats across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, spending weeks away from their farms during the critical summer months when hay needed harvesting. The tusks returned south with the hunters, attached still to the skull and snout that protected them during the long journey to European markets. The skulls served as packaging, broken apart only when ivory workers in Dublin, Trondheim, or Bergen began their craft. Recent DNA analysis of these medieval walrus remains has revealed something striking. By the 12th century, nearly all the walrus ivory reaching Europe came from a genetic population unique to Greenland's waters. The Greenlanders had achieved something approaching a monopoly on this luxury commodity. But monopolies breed dependence, and dependence creates vulnerability. The wealth flowing from walrus ivory funded the cathedral at Gardar, supported the bishop's household, paid tithes to the Norwegian crown. In the 1120s, according to later accounts, the Greenlanders used walrus ivory to secure their own bishopric from the King of Norway. Tusks functioned as currency in a society where metal coins rarely circulated. Then, gradually, the market began to shift. By the 13th century, new sources of ivory had emerged. Russian merchants supplied walrus tusks from the Barents Sea and Svalbard. More significantly, expanding trade routes from Africa began delivering elephant ivory to European workshops. Elephant tusks were larger, more consistent in quality, easier to carve into ambitious sculptures. The price of walrus ivory began its long decline. Documentary evidence traces this shift with brutal clarity. In 1282, Pope Martin IV wrote a letter to Greenland requesting that tithe payments previously rendered in walrus tusks be converted instead to silver or gold. The ivory was no longer valuable enough to justify the complex logistics of transporting it across the Atlantic. The Greenlanders responded not by abandoning the hunt, but by intensifying it. Archaeological evidence suggests that walrus hunting continued and even increased into the 14th century, even as the value per tusk collapsed. The hunting parties traveled ever farther north, past Disko Bay into waters so remote that encounters with the indigenous peoples of the high Arctic became inevitable. Rostra recovered from European sites showed decreasing tusk size over time, suggesting that hunters were taking younger, smaller animals from depleted populations. It was a classic pattern of resource depletion, working harder and harder to extract diminishing returns from an exhausted system. Norse artifacts have been found in Inuit sites as far north as Ellesmere Island, including the rivets of a boat that perhaps represented a hunting expedition that never returned home. The Greenlanders were not alone in their territory, and as their economic foundation weakened, they faced new neighbors whose skills were perfectly adapted to the changing climate. The people the Norse called Skrillinger had been present in Greenland for millennia before Erik the Red ever saw its shores. Various waves of Paleo-Eskimo cultures had occupied the island's coasts, though by the time of Norse settlement, most had apparently migrated away or died out. The first Norse settlers found only empty campsites and abandoned tools, evidence of previous inhabitants, but no living communities to confront. This changed in the 13th century. From the west, migrating across the Canadian Arctic from their ancestral lands near the Bering Strait, came a new people. Archaeologists call them the Thule culture, the direct ancestors of modern Inuit populations. They brought with them technologies perfected over generations for life in the harshest conditions on Earth. Sophisticated kayaks and umiaks for hunting sea mammals, toggling harpoons designed to hold fast in the flesh of seals and whales, clothing engineered for survival in temperatures that could kill the unprepared within hours. Where the Norse Greenlanders had adapted European farming techniques to a marginal environment, the Thule had spent centuries perfecting a way of life built entirely around the resources the Arctic provided. They did not need grass to grow or cattle to survive winter. They needed open water, sea ice, and the marine mammals that both environments supported. As the climate began cooling in the 13th century, the Thule expanded southward along Greenland's coast. By the mid-1300s, they had reached areas that brought them into contact with Norse settlements. The nature of this contact remains debated by historians. Some encounters were apparently peaceful, involving trade of metal goods the Norse possessed for furs and other Arctic products. Norse artifacts appear in Thule sites, and Thule goods have been found in Norse contexts, but other accounts suggest conflict. The Icelandic annals record that in 1379, Skrillinger attacked the eastern settlement, killed 18 men, and captured two boys as slaves. Scholars debate the reliability of this source, which survives only in later copies and may actually describe events elsewhere entirely. Yet other hints of violence appear in the archaeological record: farms that seem to have been abandoned in haste, structures that show signs of burning. The Inuit oral traditions recorded centuries later tell of sustained warfare between their ancestors and the Norse. One legend describes an Inuit leader named Kaesape who pursued a blood feud against a Norse chieftain named Ungordik across the length of southern Greenland, eventually cornering and killing him near Cape Farewell. Archaeological investigations have found no evidence supporting this specific tale, but the traditions themselves reveal that the memory of conflict persisted for generations.
Have you ever heard of the lost Norse colony of Greenland? It is a real-life historical mystery that has puzzled archaeologists and historians for centuries. Picture this, a thriving European settlement in the middle of the North Atlantic, founded by none other than Erik the Red, the legendary Viking explorer, for nearly 500 years. These Norse Greenlanders built churches, raised livestock, and traded with Europe, and then, sometime in the 15th century, they just vanished. What happened to them? Did they all die? Did they sail away? Or is the truth something far more complex? Let us dive into the fascinating and tragic story of the Greenland Vikings. Our story begins around the year 985 AD. Erik the Red, a famously hot-tempered Viking exiled from Iceland for, let us just say, some neighborly disputes, set sail westward he landed on a vast icy island. But to attract settlers, they gave it a clever marketing name, Greenland, and it worked. Hundreds of families followed him, establishing two main settlements, the eastern settlement, near modern-day Kakortok, and the western settlement, further up the coast near Nuuk. At its peak, the Norse population in Greenland reached somewhere between 2 and 5,000 people. It wasn't a huge number, but they made it work. They built homes from turf and stone, raised cattle, sheep, and goats, and hunted caribou and seals. They were devout Christians, even having their own bishop and constructing impressive stone churches, the ruins of which you can still see today for centuries. They were a remote integral part of the medieval European world. They paid their tithes to the church in Norway, often in the form of walrus tusks and narwhal ivory, which were incredibly valuable luxury goods back then. Imagine that Viking settlers on the edge of the known world, supplying European nobility with the ivory for their chess sets and crucifixes. They were tall, they were resilient, and they had created a unique Norse society on the fringes of the Arctic. They even explored further west, becoming the first Europeans to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus, as we know from the sagas and archaeological evidence that Elans Aux meadows in Newfoundland. But this connection to the wider world was also their lifeline, and that lifeline was about to get very, very thin. So what went wrong? For a long time, the prevailing theory was simple. It got cold. The world entered a period known as the Little Ice Age, starting around the 1300 in Greenland. This meant shorter growing seasons, more ice blocking the shipping lines to Europe, and a tougher environment for their livestock. Imagine trying to farm hay for your cattle when summer feels more like a chilly spring. The ice-choked fjords would have made both local travel and international trade incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for years at a time. The ships from Norway, which brought essential goods like iron, grain, and timber, started coming less and less frequently. The last confirmed ship from Europe arrived in tahun 1408 and stayed for a couple of years after that. Silence. Greenland was effectively cut off, but a changing climate is rarely the whole story. More recent research paints a much more nuanced picture. It wasn't just that it got cold, it was that the Norse Greenlanders may have been unable, or unwilling, to adapt. They were, first and foremost, European farmers. Their entire identity and way of life revolved around raising cattle and living a European style life, but Greenland wasn't Norway. Thus the climate worsened, maintaining this lifestyle became a losing battle. Their pastures shrank, and their animals struggled. This is where their neighbors, the Inuit, come into the story. The Inuit people, whose ancestors had migrated from Alaska across the Canadian Arctic, arrived in Greenland around the same time the Norse settlements were struggling. The Inuit were master Arctic hunters. Their technology was perfectly suited for the environment. They had kayaks for hunting on the open water, harpoons with toggling heads for securing large marine mammals like koalas and walruses, and deck sleds for traveling across the frozen landscape. They knew how to live bintang with bintang the Arctic, not fight against it. Archaeological evidence shows that the Norse and the Inuit were aware of each other. They traded, and sometimes they fought. Norse artifacts have been found in Inuit cities, and vice versa, but it seems the Norse never fully adopted the superior survival technologies of the Inuit. Analysis of Norse skeletons shows that as time went on, their diet shifted more and more towards marine sources, mainly shells. They were adapting, but perhaps not fast enough. They were hunting seals, but they were doing it from the shore or from their heavy wooden boats, which was far less effective than using a kayak. They never adopted the harpoon or the kayak. Why? Was it cultural pride? Did they look down on the Inuit, as Scarlings the term they use for indigenous peoples? Or was the cultural divide just too great to bridge? It is a question that still sparks debate among historians. The final years of the Norse Greenland are shrouded in mystery. The western settlement appears to have been abandoned first, sometime in the mid-1300s. Visitor in the 1340s reported finding the settlement deserted, with only wild cattle left roaming. What happened? Did they starve? Did they pack up and move to the larger eastern settlement? Or did they try to sail back to Iceland or Norway and Paris Asia? We don't take now for sure the eastern settlement held on for another century, but signs of decline are everywhere in the archaeological record. The last written record is from a wedding at Velsicute in tahun 1408. After that, the historical record goes dark. The final generation of Norse Greenlanders faced a grim reality. They were isolated, their traditional way of life was failing, and their population was shrinking. Analysis of human bones from the final period shows evidence of malnutrition and disease. They were smaller and less healthy than their ancestors. They were living on the brain. So what was the final blow? It likely wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding process. Imagine being one of the last 500 people left in the community you rely on for support, for marriage, for defense, is dwindling virtually. The center of their social world is falling into disrepair. The connection to the outside world, and with it their very identity as Europeans, is gone. It must have been a profoundly demoralizing experience. Did he simply die a slow fade to black from starvation and disease? Or did the last survivors make a final, desperate attempt to live? There are tantalizing theories that some may have assimilated with the Inuit, or even sailed away and were shipwrecked, or perhaps even joined pirate crews, but there is no concrete evidence. The most likely scenario is as a combination of factors: climate change, self-imposed isolation, a refusal to adapt, economic collapse from the loss of the ivory trade, and a slow demographic decline until the last Greenlander was gone. Their story is a powerful and sobering reminder of how a proud and resilient culture can disappear when faced with a perfect storm of challenges. The resilient ruins of their farms and churches, scattered across the Grand and Greenland steppes of southern Greenland, are the only monuments left to this lost chapter of Viking history. Thanks for watching this journey into the past. It is a complex story with no answers. Which is what makes it so captivating. What do you think was the biggest factor in their disappearance? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this historical deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more mysteries from history. See you next time.
But by approximately 1450, perhaps somewhat later, the last Norse Greenlanders were gone. When Danish missionaries arrived in 1721, seeking to re-establish contact with what they assumed was a still surviving Christian colony, they found only Inuit populations who had never seen Europeans. The ruins of Norse churches and farmsteads lay scattered across the landscape, already crumbling after centuries of abandonment. The missionaries found no living descendants of Erik the Red's settlers, no survivors who could explain what had happened. Theories about the final collapse have multiplied over the centuries. Climate deterioration remains the most commonly cited factor. Conditions simply became too harsh for European-style agriculture to survive. Economic isolation played a role, cutting the settlements off from essential imports of iron and timber, while eliminating the markets for their export goods. Conflict with the Inuit may have added pressure, though archaeological evidence for widespread violence remains scarce. Recent research has highlighted drought as a previously underappreciated factor. Sediment core from lakes near the eastern settlement show increasingly dry conditions during the 14th and 15th centuries, which would have devastated the grass production on which the entire agricultural system depended. Modern sheep farmers in the same area report that insufficient summer rain remains their primary challenge, suggesting that water scarcity has always been a limiting factor in this environment. The most likely answer is that all these factors combined, each reinforcing the others in a spiral of decline that eventually became irreversible. Climate cooling reduced agricultural production, while increasing the difficulty of the walrus hunts that provided export income. Economic isolation cut off access to the goods and institutional connections the settlements needed to remain part of European civilization. Competition with Inuit groups may have restricted access to hunting grounds and created additional stress. At some point, the population fell below whatever critical threshold was needed to maintain the social institutions, the agricultural infrastructure, the shipping capacity that survival required. Some scholars believe the end was relatively orderly. A gradual migration back to Iceland and Norway as conditions deteriorated, with the last holdouts eventually concluding that the game was no longer worth the candle. The paucity of valuable objects found in Norse sites supports this interpretation. If people fled in panic, they would have left their treasures behind. Instead, the sites look like homes that were carefully packed up before their inhabitants departed. Others see evidence of catastrophe. The burned structures, the hasty abandonments, the bodies left in passages where they fell. Perhaps a final crisis. A terrible winter, or a coordinated attack, or a disease that swept through the weakened population, ended what decades of decline had made inevitable. We may never know for certain. The last Norse Greenlanders left no final chronicle, no explanation of why they were giving up or where they hoped to go. They simply disappeared, as completely as if the ice had swallowed them. The ruins at Hvalsey still stand, their grey stone walls rising against the green of summer grass and the blue of Arctic waters. Tourists visit now, taking photographs where Thorstein and Sigrid once exchanged vows. The settlement around the church has long since vanished, but the church itself endures, the best preserved Norse structure in all of Greenland. What lessons does this haunted place hold for us? The Norse Greenlanders were not fools or failures. They were skilled farmers, capable craftsmen, devout Christians who built churches that still inspire awe 5 centuries after the last congregation departed. They adapted successfully to one of Earth's most challenging environments for nearly half a millennium. Their descendants explored North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Their trade networks spanned continents. Yet adaptation has limits. The same cultural commitments that gave the Norse Greenlanders their identity also constrained their responses to changing conditions. They could not become Inuit without ceasing to be Norse. And when the environment demanded precisely that transformation, they could not make it. Their dependence on a single export commodity made them vulnerable to market shifts beyond their control. Their isolation from institutional support networks left them alone when crisis struck. Their assumptions about how the world worked, assumptions that had served their ancestors well in Norway and Iceland, became fatal liabilities in a Greenland growing colder by the decade. The Inuit who replaced them faced the same environmental pressures, but possessed technologies and social structures evolved specifically for Arctic conditions. Where the Norse tried to impose European patterns on an Arctic landscape, the Inuit had spent generations learning to work with the land rather than against it. When the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, the Inuit adapted and survived. The Norse, for all their courage and ingenuity, could not. Today, Greenland faces climate change of the opposite sort. Warming rather than cooling, ice melting rather than advancing. The permafrost that preserved Norse clothing and bones for centuries is thawing, threatening the archaeological record even as it reveals new secrets. Modern Inuit communities must adapt to conditions as novel as those their ancestors faced when the Little Ice Age began. History offers no simple answers, but it does offer warnings. Societies built on assumptions that suddenly become invalid can collapse with terrifying speed. Adaptations that succeed in one environment may fail catastrophically when conditions change. And dependence on single resources, single trade networks, single ways of understanding the world, creates vulnerabilities that may only become apparent when it is too late to address them. In the end, the story of Norse Greenland is not merely a tale of failure. It is a story of human ambition pushing into impossible frontiers, of communities sustaining themselves for generations at the very edge of the viable, of people who woke each morning to feed their cattle and milk their sheep and teach their children prayers in a language that would never again be spoken on this island. They lost their gamble with the Arctic, but for 500 years, against odds we can barely imagine, they won. The ruins of Hvalsey Church stand in modern Greenland, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by travelers who come to see what remains of a vanished world. The stone walls that witnessed Thorstein and Sigrid's wedding in 1408 still rise against the sky. Their original white plaster long since worn away by wind and rain and the passage of centuries. They are all that remains of European civilization's most remote medieval outpost. The The last Norse Greenlanders left no explanation for their departure and no record of their destination. They simply walked out of history, leaving behind only questions that 600 years of investigation have yet to fully answer. What remains, at the edge of the ice, is silence.